Dramily.com, unlimited drama series.
My name is Alex Grant, and until 3 months ago, I thought I had a pretty decent life. Not spectacular, mind you, just decent. The kind of life where you wake up in your suburban house, kiss your wife goodbye, and pretend that the hollow feeling in your chest is just heartburn from last night's takeout. I'm a real estate lawyer, not the glamorous kind who handles million-dollar commercial deals, but the guy who makes sure your home purchase doesn't turn into a legal nightmare. 40 years old, graying at the temples, and blessed with what my daughter Emily calls dad humor, which is apparently code for jokes so bad they're almost good. Julia, my wife of 18 years, runs a PR firm downtown. She's the kind of woman who can make a garbage strike sound like a community beautification project. 37, blonde, and possessing the supernatural ability to make everyone in a room feel like they're the most important person there, until she moves on to the next target. Our house sits on Maple Street in Brookfield Heights, one of those neighborhoods where everyone knows everyone else's business, but pretends they don't. The kind of place where a new car in the driveway becomes the subject of 3 different group chats before lunch. I should have known something was wrong when Julia started working late. Again and again. Her explanations came wrapped in that practiced PR smile. Big client presentation, or crisis management for the Henderson account. The Henderson account, by the way, was a small bakery that had gotten a bad Yelp review. Hardly the stuff of midnight strategy sessions. But I'm getting ahead of myself. It started with the gifts. Not gifts to me, gifts from mysterious admirers who apparently thought my wife deserved expensive jewelry and weekend spa packages. Julia's explanation was always the same. Grateful clients showing their appreciation. "Honey, you know how emotional people get about their businesses," she'd say, fastening a diamond bracelet that probably cost more than my monthly salary. Mrs. Patterson was so thrilled with how we handled her restaurant's food poisoning incident that she insisted I accept this little token. Little token. Right. Because nothing says thank you for managing my PR crisis like a $5,000 bracelet. The phone calls were next. Julia would step outside to take them, or disappear into her home office with hushed conversations that stopped the moment I walked by. When I asked about it, she'd wave me off with practiced irritation. "Work calls, Alex. You wouldn't understand the pressure I'm under." She was right about one thing I didn't understand, but not for the reasons she thought. Emily, our 17-year-old daughter, noticed it too. She's sharp, that kid. Gets it from me, I like to think, though Julia would probably argue otherwise. Emily has this way of cutting through nonsense that would make a courtroom prosecutor weep with envy. "Mom's acting weird," she told me one evening as we loaded the dishwasher together. Julia was upstairs, allegedly working on a presentation that was apparently too confidential to discuss. "Weird how?" I asked, though I already knew what she meant. "She's different, secretive, and she keeps checking her phone like she's waiting for something important." Emily paused, studying my face. "You've noticed too, haven't you?" I had, but noticing and acting on it are 2 different things, and I've never been the confrontational type. My approach to conflict is more like a chess game played underwater. Slow, methodical, and hoping the other person drowns first. The breaking point came at the Hendersons' block party in late September. The whole neighborhood turned out, as they always do, because missing a block party in Brookfield Heights is like skipping church in a small southern town. The breaking point came at the Hendersons' block party in late September. The whole neighborhood turned out, as they always do, because missing a block party in Brookfield Heights is like skipping church in a small southern town. Technically allowed, but socially catastrophic. I was standing by the beer cooler, making small talk with Tom Rodriguez from my office, when I spotted Julia across the yard. She was deep in conversation with Megan Walsh, her best friend and the neighborhood's unofficial information broker. Megan knows everything about everyone, and she's about as good at keeping secrets as a leaky faucet. I couldn't hear what they were saying, but their body language screamed conspiracy. Heads bent together, occasional glances around to make sure nobody was listening. Julia kept touching Megan's arm, her tell for when she's trying to convince someone of something. That's when I heard it. "Taste for older men has always been Julia's weakness," Megan was saying to Sandra Peterson. Loud enough for half the party to hear. Even in college, she went for the professors instead of the fraternity boys. My hand tightened around my beer bottle. Older men. Current tense. "Well, experience does have its advantages," Sandra replied with the kind of knowing smile that makes suburban gossip so deliciously toxic. Oh, you have no idea, Megan continued, clearly enjoying her role as information distributor. Julia always said maturity was more attractive than youth. Guess some things never change. I felt something cold settle in my stomach. Not the good kind of cold you get from a beer on a hot day. The kind that makes you wonder if everything you thought you knew about your life was just an elaborate fiction. Tom noticed my expression. You okay, man? You look like you just saw a ghost. Something like that, I managed, forcing a smile that felt like it might crack my face. The rest of the party passed in a haze. I watched Julia work the crowd with her practiced charm. Noticed how she kept checking her phone. Saw the way she avoided eye contact with me whenever our paths crossed. When she suggested we head home early because she had work to catch up on, I didn't argue. That night, after Emily went to bed and Julia disappeared into her office, I sat in our living room and tried to make sense of what I'd heard. Older men, expensive gifts, secret phone calls, late nights at the office. The pieces were starting to form a picture, and I didn't like what I was seeing. I'm not a suspicious person by nature. My default setting is trust until proven otherwise, which probably makes me a terrible lawyer, but a decent human being. But even decent human beings have their limits, and I was rapidly approaching mine. The next morning, Julia left early for a breakfast meeting with a potential client. She kissed my cheek goodbye, told me she'd be home late, and walked out the door like it was just another ordinary day in our ordinary life. I waited exactly 10 minutes before I started looking through her things. I'm not proud of it, but desperation makes people do things they never thought they'd do. I went through her desk, her dresser, even her car when she forgot to take it to her breakfast meeting. What I found was a collection of small inconsistencies that, taken together, painted a picture I really didn't want to see. Hotel receipts for places she'd never mentioned visiting. Credit card statements showing charges at expensive restaurants on days when she'd claimed to be working through lunch. A business card for a jewelry store downtown. The same store where, according to the receipt I found tucked inside her planner, someone had purchased a very expensive watch just last week. But the real revelation came when I checked our joint bank account online. There had been several large transfers over the past 3 months. Money moving from our savings into an account I didn't recognize. Not enough to trigger any automatic alerts, but substantial enough to matter. I stared at the computer screen, feeling like the world's biggest fool. How long had this been going on? How long had I been sleepwalking through my own life, while my wife conducted whatever this was right under my nose? That evening, I decided to test a theory. When Julia came home, 2 hours later than she'd promised, I was waiting in the kitchen with dinner and a smile. How was your day? I asked, the picture of domestic contentment. Exhausting, she replied, not quite meeting my eyes. The Johnson account is turning into a nightmare. I might have to work this weekend to get everything sorted out. The Johnson account. I'd never heard of any Johnson account, and I made a mental note to remember that name. That's too bad, I said. Maybe I could help somehow? I know it's not my area, but— No, she interrupted, sharper than necessary. Then, catching herself, I mean, thank you, honey, but it's really complicated. Better if I handle it myself. Better if she handled it herself. Right. We ate dinner in relative silence, making the kind of small talk that married couples perfect over years of practice. Emily joined us, filling the quiet spaces with stories about school and friends and the drama that seems to define teenage existence. Julia smiled and nodded at the appropriate moments, but I could tell her mind was elsewhere. After Emily went upstairs to do homework, Julia announced she had more work to do and disappeared into her office. I cleaned up the kitchen, loaded the dishwasher, and tried to convince myself that I was overreacting. Maybe there was a perfectly reasonable explanation for everything. Maybe I was letting paranoia and neighborhood gossip turn innocent coincidences into something sinister. Then Julia's phone rang. She'd left it on the kitchen counter, a rare oversight for someone who usually guarded that device like state secrets. I glanced toward her office, heard the sound of typing, and made a decision that would change everything. I looked at the screen. The caller ID said Charles. My father's name is Charles. The phone stopped ringing, then immediately started again. Same name. Same number that I'd been calling Dad for 40 years. I stood there, frozen, while the implications crashed over me like a wave. My father, my wife, the expensive gifts, the secret meetings, the sudden interest in older men. The phone went quiet, then buzzed with a text message. Can't wait to see you tomorrow. Same place, same time. Nishier. I set the phone down carefully, my hands surprisingly steady. Walked to the sink, poured myself a glass of water, and drank it slowly while my world rearranged itself around this new, horrible reality. My wife was having an affair with my father, and tomorrow, I was going to find out exactly what that meant. I didn't sleep that night. How could I? Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that text message burned into my retinas like a neon sign. Can't wait to see you tomorrow. Same place, same time. Julia slept peacefully beside me, or at least she appeared to. For all I knew, she was lying there planning her next move in whatever game she and my father were playing. The thought made my skin crawl. By morning, I had a plan. Not a good plan, necessarily, but a plan nonetheless. If Julia was meeting my father today, I was going to find out where and why. The why part was making my stomach churn, but I needed to know the full scope of what I was dealing with. Julia left the house at 9:30, claiming she had client meetings all day. She kissed my cheek goodbye, the same perfunctory peck she'd been giving me for months, and told me not to wait up because she'd be working late. Big presentation tomorrow, she said, adjusting her makeup in the hallway mirror. You know how it is. I knew how it was, all right, just not the way she thought I did. I waited until her car disappeared around the corner, then called my office and told Tom the first was taking a personal day. He didn't ask questions, which I appreciated. Tom's good that way. He understands that sometimes life requires immediate attention, and paperwork can wait. Then I got in my car and drove to the Riverside Hotel downtown. Why the Riverside? Because that's where two of those mysterious receipts had come from, and it seemed like the kind of place someone would choose for clandestine meetings. Upscale enough to feel special, busy enough to provide anonymity, the perfect spot for people who needed to hide in plain sight. I parked across the street and settled in to wait. This felt ridiculous, like something out of a bad detective movie. But ridiculous or not, I needed to know what I was dealing with. At 11:15, my father's silver Mercedes pulled into the hotel's valet parking. I watched him get out, straighten his tie, and walk through the front entrance like he owned the place. Charles Grant has always carried himself that way, with the confidence of a man who spent 30 years as a respected judge and never learned to doubt himself. 20 minutes later, Julia's blue BMW arrived. I sat there, gripping my steering wheel, watching my wife hand her keys to the valet and follow the same path my father had taken. She moved with purpose, like someone who'd made this trip before, like someone who knew exactly where she was going and who would be waiting for her. The smart thing would have been to leave then, to go home, pack my things, and start the process of untangling my life from this mess. But I've never been accused of being smart, and I needed more than suspicion. I needed proof, so I waited and waited. 2 hours and 37 minutes later, they came out together. I watched through my windshield as my father and my wife emerged from the hotel, walking close but not touching. They paused at the valet stand, and I saw my father lean in to say something that made Julia laugh. Not her polite, social laugh, the real one, the one I hadn't heard in months. Then he kissed her, right there on the sidewalk, in broad daylight, where anyone could see them. It wasn't a friendly peck on the cheek or an innocent gesture between in-laws. It was the kind of kiss that left no doubt about the nature of their relationship. I pulled out my phone and took pictures. My hands were shaking, but I managed to get several clear shots before they separated and went to their respective cars. Evidence, proof, whatever you wanted to call it, I now had it in digital form. The drive home was a blur. I remember stopping at red lights, making turns, parking in my driveway. But it all felt like someone else was doing it, while I watched from somewhere outside my own body. Inside the house, I sat at my kitchen table and stared at the photos on my phone. There was no denying what I was seeing, no way to rationalize it into something innocent. My father and my wife were having an affair, and from the looks of things, it had been going on for a while. But why? That was the question that kept circling through my mind like a vulture. Why my father? Why now? What could possibly be worth destroying two families, and 30 years of relationship between a father and son? The answer came to me as I was making coffee, and it hit me like a physical blow. The inheritance. My father is worth approximately $3 million. Not a fortune by some standards, but substantial enough to matter. Money from his judicial pension, investments, and the family property that's been in the Grant name for 4 generations. Money that, according to his current will, was supposed to come to me when he passed away. But wills can be changed. I set down my coffee mug and tried to think this through logically. Julia's a smart woman, smart enough to know that seducing a 62-year-old man requires more than physical attraction. She'd need to offer him something he wanted, something he couldn't get elsewhere. What did my father want that I couldn't give him? Validation, maybe. The feeling of being desired.
He texted at 2 a.m. Leave the door unlocked. You left our door unlocked for him?
Once it was
Watch more on Grammarly.com.
By a younger, attractive woman. The thrill of forbidden romance. Or maybe just the simple pleasure of taking something that belonged to his son. A final assertion of dominance in a relationship that had always been complicated. Charles Grant was never an easy father. Demanding, critical, impossible to please. Nothing I ever did was quite good enough, quite smart enough, quite successful enough. Even now at 40, I still found myself seeking his approval like a trained dog looking for treats. Maybe Julia had figured that out. Maybe she'd realized that the way to Charles Grant's wallet was through his ego, and she'd been playing that game while I stumbled around in ignorance. The more I thought about it, the more sense it made. The expensive gifts weren't from grateful clients. They were from my father. The secret meetings weren't about work. They were about planning my financial destruction. The late nights weren't about PR crises. They were about rewriting my future without my knowledge or consent. Needed help. Professional help from someone who knew how to investigate this kind of situation properly. I'd seen enough detective shows to know that amateur surveillance only gets you so far. And I was way out of my depth. And that's how I found Rita Castellanos. Rita runs a private investigation firm downtown. The kind of place that advertises discretion and delivers results. I'd never had occasion to use her services before. But Tom had mentioned her name once in connection with a messy divorce case. She's expensive, he'd said, but she's thorough. Thorough was exactly what I needed. I called her office and made an appointment for that afternoon. When I walked into her waiting room, I felt like I was crossing some kind of line, moving from suspicion into active investigation, from victim into participant. Rita turned out to be a small, sharp-eyed woman in her 50s who listened to my story without judgment or surprise. She'd heard it all before, apparently. Cheating spouses, family betrayals, financial manipulation. Just another day at the office for someone in her line of work. "How much proof do you need?" she asked when I finished explaining the situation. "Enough to protect myself legally," I said. "And enough to make sure they can't do this to anyone else." She quoted me a daily rate that made me wince, but I agreed to it. What choice did I have? If I was right about the inheritance angle, 3 days of investigation fees would be a bargain compared to losing $3 million. "I'll need access to financial records," Rita said, making notes on a yellow legal pad. "Bank statements, credit reports, anything you can get me. And I'll need to know their routines, their habits, their regular meeting places." I gave her everything I had, the hotel receipts, the bank transfer information, copies of the photos I'd taken. She reviewed it all with the methodical attention of someone who'd built a career on other people's secrets. "This is good," she said finally. "More than most people bring me on their first visit. You've got instincts for this kind of work." I wasn't sure if that was a compliment or a character flaw, but I thanked her anyway. "One more thing," Rita said as I was getting ready to leave. "Are you prepared for what we might find? Because once we start digging, there's no going back. Whatever's really going on here, you're going to know all of it." I thought about that for a moment. Was I prepared? Did I really want to know the full extent of how my wife and father had betrayed me? Wouldn't it be easier to just file for divorce and walk away? "I need to know," I said finally. "Whatever it is, I need to know." Rita nodded. "Then we'll find out together. I'll have preliminary information for you by tomorrow evening." I drove home feeling like I'd just hired someone to perform surgery on my life. Necessary surgery, maybe, but the kind that leaves scars regardless of how well it goes. Julia came home at 8:30, full of apologies about her late day and stories about difficult clients. I listened with what I hoped was appropriate interest, nodding at the right moments and asking the occasional question. It was like performing in a play where only I knew the real plot. "How was your day?" she asked as we got ready for bed. "Quiet," I said. "Just caught up on some paperwork." She smiled and kissed my forehead. "My hard-working husband. I'm lucky to have you." Lucky, right. As I lay in bed that night, listening to Julia's breathing settle into the rhythm of sleep, I wondered how long this performance would continue. How long could I pretend everything was normal while Rita gathered evidence of my wife's betrayal? How long could I smile and nod and play the role of the oblivious husband? Not much longer, I suspected. The truth has a way of demanding attention, and mine was getting louder by the hour. Tomorrow, Rita would start earning her fee, and I would start learning exactly how deep this rabbit hole went. I had a feeling it was going to be deeper than I'd imagined. Rita called me at work the next afternoon with an update that confirmed my worst fears and introduced some new ones I hadn't considered. "Your wife's been busy," she said without preamble. 3 separate bank accounts, all opened within the last 6 months. 2 joint accounts with your father, and 1 individual account that's been receiving regular transfers from both of them. I closed my office door and sat down heavily in my chair. How much money are we talking about? Combined? About $400,000. Your father's been liquidating investments, and your wife's been moving money out of your joint accounts in small increments to avoid triggering any automatic alerts. $400,000. The number hit me like a punch to the stomach. "That's not inheritance money," I said. "That's planning money." "That's what I thought too," Rita agreed. "So I did some digging into your father's legal affairs. Alex, when's the last time you saw a copy of his will?" I had to think about that. Maybe 5 years ago, when he had that minor heart episode and wanted to make sure everything was in order. Well, he's made some changes since then. Major changes. I have a contact at his lawyer's office. Let's just say people talk when they're concerned about what they're seeing. Your father revised his will 3 months ago. 3 months. Right around the time Julia started working late and receiving expensive gifts from mysterious clients. "What kind of revisions?" I asked, though I was pretty sure I already knew. "The kind that leave you with nothing," Rita said bluntly. "Everything goes to a trust fund managed by Julia. Officially, it's set up to provide for your daughter's education and future, but Julia has complete discretionary control over the funds." I stared out my office window at the parking lot below, watching normal people go about their normal lives while mine disintegrated in real time. "So Julia gets control of my father's money, and I get nothing. It gets worse," Rita continued. "I also found evidence that your wife has been building a case for divorce. She's been documenting what she claims are instances of your emotional instability, financial irresponsibility, and neglect of family duties. She's got photos, written statements, even recordings of arguments you probably don't remember having." "Recordings?" The word came out as a croak. "Your house is bugged, Alex. At least 3 devices that I could identify from the background noise analysis. She's been recording your conversations for months." The room seemed to tilt sideways. Everything I'd said, every private moment, every expression of frustration or confusion, it had all been captured and filed away for future use against me. "There's more," Rita said, and I wondered how there could possibly be more. "Your father's been consulting with a psychiatrist about your mental health, Dr. Elizabeth Morrison, downtown practice. According to my source, he's been painting a picture of a son who's become increasingly paranoid and unstable." Paranoid. The irony would have been funny if it hadn't been so devastating. "So let me make sure I understand this," I said slowly. "My wife seduces my father, convinces him to change his will in her favor, builds a case for divorce that portrays me as mentally unstable, and documents everything to ensure she gets custody of Emily and control of the family money." "That's the size of it," Rita confirmed. "It's actually quite sophisticated. Your wife's PR background is serving her well. She knows how to craft a narrative and make it stick." I sat there for a long moment, trying to process the scope of their betrayal. It wasn't just an affair. It was a complete destruction of my life, planned and executed with surgical precision. "What are my options?" I asked finally. "Legally? You could try to contest the will and fight the divorce, but that's going to be expensive and difficult given the evidence they've compiled against you. Your wife's been very thorough." "Non-officially?" Rita was quiet for a moment. "That depends on how far you're willing to go to protect yourself." How far was I willing to go? A week ago, I would have said not very far. I'd have hired a lawyer, tried to work things out through proper channels, maybe salvage something from the wreckage of my marriage and relationship with my father. But that was before I knew the full extent of their planning, before I understood that this wasn't just betrayal, it was warfare, and they'd been fighting while I didn't even know there was a battle. I need to think about this, I told Rita. Don't think too long, she advised. According to my sources, your wife's planning to file for divorce within the next 2 weeks. Once she does that, you'll be playing defense instead of offense. After Rita hung up, I sat in my office and stared at the wall. Tom knocked on my door around 4:30, but I told him I was busy and couldn't be disturbed. I needed time to think, to plan, to figure out how to respond to this level of calculated betrayal. The old Alex, the trusting, accommodating Alex who believed in working things out through proper channels, would have been overwhelmed. But something had changed in me over the past few days. Maybe it was anger, maybe it was survival instinct, but I felt a cold clarity settling over me like armor. If Julia and my father wanted to play games, I could play games too. And I had advantages they didn't know about. I knew they were coming for me, but they didn't know I knew. I understood their plan, but they thought I was still stumbling around in ignorance. Most importantly, I was a lawyer with 18 years of experience in real estate transactions, contract law, and the kind of financial maneuvering that makes complex deals work. I knew how to read documents, how to find loopholes, and how to make problems disappear through creative paperwork. Julia might be good at crafting narratives, but I was good at crafting legal realities. I spent the rest of the afternoon making phone calls and setting up meetings. First, I called my own lawyer, not the firm's lawyer, but a private attorney named Diane Chen, who specialized in family law and asset protection. I'd referred clients to her before, and she owed me a few favors. I need to see you tonight, I told her. It's urgent, and it's complicated. How complicated? Diane asked. The kind that involves family betrayal, financial fraud, and a very sophisticated attempt to destroy my life. I'll stay late, she said immediately. Bring everything you have. Next, I called my accountant and asked him to pull together 5 years of financial records for both my personal and business accounts. Then I called my insurance agent and asked about umbrella policies that might protect my assets in the event of a contentious divorce. Finally, I called Rita back. I've made a decision, I told her. I want to fight back, but I want to do it smart. Can you help me with that? Depends on what you have in mind, she said cautiously. I want to know everything about their plan before they execute it. Every meeting, every phone call, every document. And I want to know their weaknesses, what they're afraid of, what they can't afford to lose, what would hurt them most if it became public. That's doable, Rita said. But it's going to be expensive, and it's going to require some activities that exist in legal gray areas. How gray? Let's just say we'll be gathering information through methods that wouldn't be admissible in court, but would be very useful for strategic planning. I thought about that. A week ago, the idea of engaging in legally questionable activities would have horrified me. But a week ago, I didn't know that my wife had been recording my conversations and building a case to portray me as mentally unstable. Do it, I said. Whatever it takes. That evening, I met with Diane Chen in her downtown office. She listened to my story with the kind of professional calm that comes from years of dealing with family disasters, taking notes and asking pointed questions about timelines and evidence. This is sophisticated, she said when I finished. Your wife clearly understands the legal system and how to manipulate it. But there are some things that work in your favor, such as the timing, for one thing. The fact that your father changed his will so recently, combined with the evidence of their affair, suggests undue influence. That's something we can challenge. And the recordings, Deanne smiled grimly. Depending on how they were obtained, they might not be admissible. And if your wife was recording conversations without your consent, she might have violated wiretapping laws. What about the money they've already moved? That's trickier, but not impossible. If we can prove the transfers were made without your knowledge or consent, we might be able to recover some of it. We spent 2 hours going through my options, mapping out strategies, and identifying the evidence I'd need to build a strong defense. By the time I left Diane's office, I had a plan. It wasn't a nice plan. It wasn't the kind of thing the old Alex would have considered. But the old Alex had been betrayed, manipulated, and set up for destruction by the 2 people he'd trusted most in the world. The new Alex was going to fight back. I drove home that night feeling something I hadn't experienced in months: hope. Not the naive hope that everything would work out fine, but the cold, practical hope that comes from having a plan and the resources to execute it. Julia was waiting for me when I got home, full of concern about my late night and questions about where I'd been. Just had to take care of some business, I told her, which was technically true. You seem different lately, she said, studying my face. More distant. I smiled and kissed her cheek. Just work stress. You know how it is. She relaxed slightly. Well, try not to let it get to you too much. Stress can make people do irrational things. Irrational things, like trusting your wife and father not to destroy your life while you're not looking. I'll keep that in mind, I said. As I got ready for bed, I thought about what Rita had told me earlier. Julia was planning to file for divorce within 2 weeks. That gave me a narrow window to gather information and prepare my counterattack. 2 weeks to turn the tables on people who thought they held all the cards. 2 weeks to prove that paranoia isn't always a mental health issue. Sometimes it's just pattern recognition. I fell asleep that night with a smile on my face. Tomorrow, the real game would begin. Rita's intelligence network proved to be even more extensive than I'd hoped. By